Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog here on Mint Press with me, Lowkey. I hope that you can see we are striving to go against the grain in our coverage, looking at stories that the mainstream media regularly neglect. For that reason, it is vital we have your support. So I would ask you to subscribe, to like, to drop comments on this video, but also contribute to the Patreon if you can. Now, today we are sitting on the beginning of a phase where China is becoming more and more the target for major, unfortunately, military action. And that can be seen in the recent announcement of the US, UK, Australia coalition and the arming of Australia with nuclear submarines, nuclear powered submarines, though, to be precise, in a deal which is likely to favor Rolls-Royce and BAE Systems. BAE Systems have come out with an announcement today. As a company with a significant presence in all three markets, we stand ready to support the UK-US discussions as they progress. It is important to note that Australia, despite being put in this position where it is likely to be used against China, its number one trading partner is China. And while the UK, up until the withdrawal from Afghanistan, had military based in 5 countries around China, today it seems to be 4. It has a naval base in Singapore, has garrisons in Brunei, drone testing sites in Australia, and 3 military facilities in Nepal. Also, the United States is believed to have 300 to 400 bases around China. When talking about China, you are talking about 1/5 of the world's population. It's 1.4 billion people. Historically, there are at least 4 to 5 periods of human history in which China has had the most advanced polity in the world. And as Samuel Huntington, of all people, said, the West won the world by its superiority in applying organized violence. What did that mean? It meant that from 1750 to 1900, the UK share of world manufacturing went from 2% to 23%. The US share went from 0.1% to 24%, whereas China's share of manufacturing went from 33% to 6%. India's went from 25% to 2%. As they say, with the British, the trade followed the flag. And that is what happens when you occupy 14 million miles of the globe. In 1997, when Tony Blair was handing back Hong Kong to the Chinese, he said he only had a dim idea of what the history between Britain and China was. Well, the first Opium War from 1830 to the 1840s, it was how Britain got hold of Hong Kong in the first place. And it was the imposition on the Chinese of Britain's trade in opium. It was forcing the Chinese to legislate that opium could be sold and consumed within China. The foreign minister at the time, Lord Palmerston, said this will form an epoch in the progress of civilization of the human race. Also in the 1850s, Britain fought in the Taiping Rebellion, and pre-World War I, the Taiping Rebellion was the most costly war in recorded human history in terms of human suffering. Britain managed to fight on both sides of the Taiping Rebellion, and the rebels that they were fighting against at one point, again, wanted to legislate against opium trade. So what happened was you had 20 million people die in the Taiping Rebellion, with the British contributing to that death toll massively. You had 3 opium wars in which the British forced the Chinese to accept that millions of their citizens would be drugged by British opium. Today, where are we? China is projected by people like Goldman Sachs to become the world's #1 economy by 2026. Britain is projected to fall from the fifth largest economy to the 11th largest economy over the next decade or so. China is not isolated in any way, shape, or form. It is the largest trading partner with Brazil, the largest trading partner with India, the largest trading partner with China. And whether it's through the Shanghai Five or in the EU, the 16+1 cooperation that China has with Central European states, or it is the Belt and Road Initiative, whereby the Chinese government has set forth that it will invest in 70 different countries and international organizations. Or it's looking at the way that Brexit has affected Britain. Britain has come out of it, replacing Germany as its biggest source of goods and supplies with China. You have Chinese students in the UK that pay £1.7 billion per year in tuition. You have US debt of $1.1 trillion held by the Chinese. And every day, the US sells $2 billion of debt to the Chinese. It would be wise to warn the United States, who seem more isolated than ever, actually, that China is far from Iraq and Afghanistan, and they should be very, very careful about their next steps. In Britain, we have seen Michael Gove appointed as the housing minister. Michael Gove is somebody that has a history as a co-founder of the neocon Henry Jackson Society, which pushed relentlessly for the Prevent program, a surveillance operation in public institutions targeting specifically Muslims, and often opening the space for children who are deemed to be Muslim by the state to be questioned by police without the presence or foreknowledge of their parents or carers. The Henry Jackson Society has shared funders with the Friends of the IDF, illegal settlements in the West Bank, and Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins. Also, you have seen the political council of the Henry Jackson Society act as an incubator for other figures in the British political system, like Priti Patel and Amber Rudd. Of course, Amber Rudd is well known for being the deporter of the Windrush generation, and Priti Patel has been well known for passing legislation recently which will allow the British maritime forces to push boats back. Remember, she had a job with Viasat, the company that do the satellite systems for Royal Navy ships. And she, as has Katie Hopkins, have been advocates for the using of Royal Navy ships in the pushing back of quote unquote migrant boats. But more relevant to Michael Gove's appointment as housing minister, you have the documents which show less than a month ago or around a month ago, he was given £100,000 by the property developer, Zach Gertler. Now, Zach Gertler is a close friend of Benjamin Netanyahu, funded his election campaign. He was the managing director of the US State Department funded Policy Forum and is a patron of the illegal settlement building Jewish National Fund in Palestine. So it's quite clear to see that we have our work cut out for us with Michael Gove, especially if we expect him to advocate and help and pass legislation that will seriously deal with the situation we have here, where communities like the one I live in, we saw cladding that was placed on the building by a massive US construction company, Arconic, lead to the deaths of 72 people. And across the country today, we see hospitals, hotels, schools, and homes covered in dangerous, flammable material, still yet to be removed. And in many cases, the inhabitants of those buildings being forced to pay to get those removed and unable to sell the leases for their properties. It is very unlikely they will find a listening ear in Michael Gove. We also see Liz Truss put forward as the secretary, the foreign secretary, Liz Truss, of course, was courted by the neocon think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, which is funded by ExxonMobil, Shell, and the Koch brothers. As a trade minister, she forced weapons sales to Saudi Arabia to continue, well, to restart essentially, even after 15 billion pounds worth of BAE Systems arms had helped drive Yemen to the point of famine in the largest humanitarian crisis in the world today. What can we expect from Liz Truss as Secretary of Foreign Affairs apart from more servility to the status quo? We are also seeing more media attention focusing on Shamima Begum. Of course, this was a 15-year-old child who entered Syria at the time of massive mobilization of military hardware towards the region to face off ISIS. At that time, when Shamima Begum took her trip, it was reported by Reuters that this trip was facilitated by an intelligence agent from the US-led coalition. However, when dealing with Shamima Begum, who now is languishing in one of the camps of northern Syria, today you have the way in which she is dealt with is not as a person who has lost 3 children to the conditions, but also she is not dealt with as somebody who potentially could have been trafficked by an intelligence agent from the US-led coalition. And in fact, what you see is a greater accountability targeted towards a child than you see for intelligence agencies involved in that campaign. Now, the next speaker, the next guest that we have today may have some interesting insights to give us on many of these issues. He is a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy since 2010. In 2009, he had resigned from his post in Afghanistan with the State Department for a few different reasons, and we are going to go into them today. He had previously been part of the US occupation of Iraq, and he has won prizes from the Reidenhauer Prize for Truth Telling. He is somebody who is involved in the campaign to free Julian Assange. He is an advisory board member for the Committee to Defend Julian Assange and Civil Liberties. We are joined today by former State Department employee Matthew Ho. How are you, Matthew?
Hi, Kareem. Thank you so much for having me with you.
It's great to be joined by you. So to start with, your work as a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, it has a program called the Arms and Security Project. And I was quite taken by a quote from the program director, William D. Hartung. He said, "The use of military force is largely irrelevant in addressing the greatest dangers we face, from terrorism to nuclear proliferation, to epidemics of disease, to climate change, to inequities of wealth and income. The allocation of budgetary resources needs to be changed to reflect this reality." Now, when we look at the United States, it has a military expenditure larger than the next 7 militaries put together. Of course, we know that the US military as an institution is the largest emitter of, it's the largest source of carbon emissions. In comparison to 99% of think tanks based in Washington, D.C., who essentially seem to be seeking a greater allocation of funds towards the military juggernaut, which sits on top of the United States. What's different about the Center for International Policy?
Well, thanks for asking me about CIP. CIP has been around since the late 1970s, and it was started by a few people who had witnessed personally what the U.S. had done throughout Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, parts of Thailand, and saw what the United States was continuing to do in Central America. And that is basically the genesis of CIP. People coming together to form an organization that would speak out and lobby to prevent the American government from repeating what it had done in Southeast Asia, from continuing what it was doing in Central America, from and just basically to be at least some form of organized voices against the crimes of the empire, basically to put it. And throughout time, CIP has been a home for men and women who have dissented against the U.S. government. There have been plenty of people who have been a part of CIP, men like, say, Bob White, who have been U.S. ambassador in Central America, who have resigned in protest over the President Reagan's policies in Central America, which included, of course, support to despotic and human rights violating regimes, or support for death squads, support for the Contras, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the legacy of CIP. CIP does not take, with a couple of exceptions for a couple of environmental programs, including a deforestation program. CIP does not take money from corporations. So it's all done through foundations and individuals, which is also makes it different than most of the other think tanks in Washington. And we're also a home to many people who get censored. Bill Hartung, who you just quoted, Bill is one of the best experts on the American military budget, on the war budgets, on the and not just on the budgets, but on everything that falls around that. So all the defense and companies and such. Bill came to us about 10 years or so ago because he was at another think tank where he was censored, where what he was writing, the think tank did not want him to publish because it would upset their funders, their donors, the corporations that give them money. So, I mean, that's a very real thing. Anyone who thinks that somehow these organizations in DC that are receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, are somehow not responsive to their donors and don't actively pursue the donors' interests, I don't know what to tell you, but that's just the way the world works, So, CIP, I've been a part of CIP for 10 years. It's been a great home for me. And I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to give a little pitch about them.
No, I think absolutely. And I think an increased criticality when dealing with talking heads which are put forward by the media is vital if we're going to understand, this concept of agnotology. So the carefully constructed ignorance within society. If we look at, for example, in Britain, you have RUSI, Royal United Services Institute, which is funded by BAE Systems, Lockheed Martin, and Shell. You look at, and regularly, for instance, Tony Blair spoke at them recently, and it's not reported in any of the coverage that his speech received the source of funding for this very think tank. You look at the Brookings Institution, for example, in the US. This is another one which has funding from various different places, various different agencies. And essentially, this is a way in which you can, what they call astroturf, the agency of the powerful, and kind of give a benign appearance to what are quite seriously damaging ideas for democracy within any country. Now, when you worked in Afghanistan and you resigned in 2009, what was exactly the last straw? Because when we look at misallocation of funds, when we look at empowering warlords, when we look at empowering those involved in the drug trade, Afghanistan wasn't the first place in which the US government had done that. So what was the final straw?
Well, for me, it was just a culmination. I had gone to Afghanistan, and I was already intellectually and morally broken from taking part in the Iraq War. I'd been to the Iraq War twice, and I'd supported the Iraq War through my work in Washington, D.C. for years. And by the time I got to Afghanistan, I was just, again, morally and intellectually broken and holding on to the hope that somehow the Afghan war was going to be different, that somehow the Afghan war was going to be, um, uh, uh, you know, fundamentally a war that was worth fighting. You know, and I was grasping at that point, right? Really trying just to hold on to something, because I didn't want to let go of who I had become, of the career I was in. I was dealing with a lot of mental, emotional, spiritual issues, and you know, there's a duality inside all of us. And you know, put it kind of bluntly, I have one side of me that was invested in my career and being part of something bigger than me, you know, being an officer of the empire, and that was not who the just you know, moral side was. And so there had been this conflict in me. And then when I got to Afghanistan, and one of the ways that I had dealt with that internal conflict was by was through, you know, heavily drinking. And when I got to Afghanistan, I wasn't able to drink. You know, I mean, I was, you know, if I was at the embassy, I could drink, but other than that, when I was doing my job out in the provinces, you couldn't. And so that allowed, you know, I've been using the alcohol basically to kind of subjugate and beat down that part of myself that was intellectually and morally honest. And so, kind of like you know, wildflowers, it sprung up, and so there just, you know, but the main thing was the fact that the war was not fundamentally different than the war in Iraq. It was exactly the same thing, and I knew that. You know, I mean, it's just allowing myself to admit that. You know, allowing myself to admit that I was taking part in the same continuous line of American history that stretches back centuries. That the occupation of Afghanistan is just, you know, and the occupation of Iraq and the wars in Syria, Libya, Yemen, etc., are all just the latest in a long line of wars of empire, of imperial efforts. You know, it stretches back to the genocide of the Native Americans. But admitting that to myself was very difficult, and it had to take, I guess, at that point, seeing that the war in Afghanistan was no fundamentally different than the war in Iraq. That you know, what I was witnessing there, the blood and the suffering, you know, was serving no purpose other than enriching, you know, the United States, and in particular, because Afghanistan is a bit different than Iraq in some ways, and one of them is the sense that there was not much extraction from Afghanistan like you have from Iraq in terms of looting, like an empire looting a place, and we can get into that, how that was different, but again, fundamentally is no different. So seeing the suffering, the killing, the blood, you know, seeing the corruption, seeing just you know, having to just go along with the lies. I don't know if there was one thing that really kind of pushed me over as much as it was just all the culmination of all that. I guess if it would have been the elections in the summer of '09, the presidential elections in Afghanistan, August '09, witnessing just the you know, absolute theft of that election. I mean, I was on an Afghan army base, and you know, I saw Afghan soldiers stuffing ballot boxes. There was not supposed to be a polling station there. They certainly weren't supposed to be stuffing ballot boxes. And you know, and at that point in summer of '09, the president of the United States had been saying we are rushing, you know, thousands of American soldiers to Afghanistan, which they were, to ensure that the Afghans have free and fair elections. And of course, that was completely untrue. And seeing, you know, these young men and women being sent there to kill and to be killed, to see Afghans being killed over this, you know, this lie about, right? Yeah. So,
and that was the election that I think Abdullah was supposed to have won, but Karzai was then imposed still by the U.S. government. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was one of several. Each of the elections that were held in Afghanistan have been massively fraudulent, and they actually got worse each one, I guess, in terms of the brazenness. But in this case, yeah, Karzai, I think, claimed he had 54% of the ballot. I don't think there's any actual real ballot that was conducted, and Abdullah threatened to break away from, pull his support from the government, which would have collapsed. And as you saw, everyone saw how quickly the Afghan government collapsed in these last few months, the same thing would have happened in 2009. I mean, this has always been a house of cards, right? So any little thing is going to cause it to collapse. That's exactly what happened. You had the United States basically bang heads together within the Afghan government, within the community that supported the Afghan government, keep Karzai in power. And, I mean, so the whole depravity of it, right? The whole mendacity of it, this idea that we're somehow spreading democracy, and then we watch an election get stolen, and we send 30,000 more U.S. troops to Afghanistan after the election was stolen. We sent about, when President Obama comes into office in 2000, January 2010, there are about 30,000 American troops in Afghanistan and about 30,000 NATO troops and contractors. Within a year and a half, there's 100,000 U.S. troops, 40,000 NATO troops, and more than 100,000 contractors. So after Karzai steals these elections, he is rewarded with the presence of a 250,000-man Western army to keep him in power. That was the reality of it.
And really, in a way, in order to buttress this corrupt government, this status quo that we could say a majority of Afghans were against, definitely, you talk about having to divvy up money in order to sort of buy hearts and minds, or at least on the surface of it, buy cooperation. And the exact quote I have from the great piece by Alan MacLeod in the Mint Press article that comes from you, it says, "Holy cow, I was living like Scarface. I was paying out anywhere between $300,000 to $400,000 per week to $5 million per week at times, all in cash. I had $50 million in cash. The most I ever had at one point was $24 million on hand in $100 bills, sitting in safes in my bedroom." And then when you talk about work in Iraq, you say, once we signed that money out of the vault in Baghdad, it was up to me how to document how that money was spent and where it went. I had no requirement. Literally, I am not joking. No guidance and no requirement to provide documentation about where that money went.
Yeah, that was the situation in Iraq, and Afghanistan was not much different in terms of the way the money was spent. There had been some controls put on the money, by 2009, 2010 in Afghanistan, because of some scandals, basically, because the newspapers got a hold of it. Because people were stealing the money left and right. I mean, there wasn't just there was two aspects of it. There was the licit corruption and the illicit corruption. The licit corruption was the U.S. Congress appropriating billions of dollars to rebuild these countries, and 40% of that money just being taken right by American contractors for overhead and management costs. So in the case of Iraq, when the U.S. government appropriates $16 billion for what's called the Iraq Reconstruction and Relief Fund, 40% of that money never even leaves the United States. It just goes right into corporations. And then, I don't know, anywhere from 25 to 40% of the rest of that money is then, kept by subcontractors. So by the time you get to the actual project where you're going to build a school or a healthcare center or a road or whatever you're supposed to do, there's only about 10 cents left on the dollar for the actual project. And that's the illicit corruption that goes on, right? I mean, because it's just one Western corporation after another. And then, of course, the partners of the United States and the West in these countries were corrupt. Basically in both situations, the United States and its allies in both Iraq and Afghanistan built countries where the rule of law was basically the rule by guys with the guns. That's how it worked. And so these men, almost all men, certainly in Afghanistan, it was all men, and in Afghanistan, 97% men, took the money. They took their cut. And so by the time, again, you get down to like the level where you're going to build this school, there's only about 10 cents of every dollar left. So the corruption was massive. It was one big grift. It was one big racket. There was very little control. And part of it was that within both the U.S. and the U.K., because from what I saw, the U.K. was just as bad as the U.S. was. So the British was just as bad as my Irish friends get upset if I say UK, so I'll try not to say that. But the Brits were just as bad as us Americans were, in the sense that this idea that spending money was somehow showing progress. The more money you spent was, well, you're making progress. That it was a metric to demonstrate that you were doing something. So that if Kareem, if you were my predecessor there and you spent $10 million, my goal was to spend $15 million to show that I was better than you. I mean, there's a lot of just organizational or institutional, madness that was present. Just how do you prove you're better institutionally or individually? But then too, it just also fed the corruption, just fed the insecurity, it fed the instability. And you're rewarding basically the very worst of the population. I mean, you had in both cases, but especially in Afghanistan, there was a government of warlords, and so these men were getting rich, and rich. These were well documented members of the government, shipping out tens of millions of dollars every day out of the country. So the corruption was massive on both sides. It was one great looting, and plenty of people made a lot of money, and very, very little was actually accomplished for either the Iraqi people or the Afghan people.
It's interesting because this is a case where the micro is interacting with the macro. The Coalition Provisional Authority that ruled Iraq for the first year of the US invasion, it passed 100 legally binding administrative orders. Order 30 was the deregulation of wage protection and the labor market. In terms of the banking sector, you had many of the orders referring directly to it. You also had Order 39, 46, and 51, the privatization of state enterprise. And so by the end, what you had were 200 state-owned enterprises dismantled, from electricity, telecommunications, pharmaceutical industry taken over by foreign control, and also 100% foreign ownership of banks, mines, and factories. What you also had was the reducing of corporation tax from 45% to 15%. And during the first year of the occupation, you had about $50 billion of reconstruction contracts going to US corporations like Bechtel, Skylink USA, Halliburton, Bearing Point. And during that very same period, it was estimated that only 2% of the contracts went to Iraqi firms. Of course, Article 55 of the Hague Regulations shows that it is not legal to privatize a country's assets while it is under the occupation of a foreign military power. You also look at Kellogg, Brown and Root getting a $7 billion contract a week before the invasion started. It was at that time the largest no-bid contract in the history of the United States. When you look at it overall, Iraq Revenue Watch of 2004 found that 150 US firms had collectively landed reconstruction contracts in Iraq and Afghanistan worth $48.7 billion. And they found that US and UK companies received 85% of the value of contracts worth over $5 million tendered by the CPA. And 73% of all the contracts that were worth more than $5 million were not tendered competitively, meaning they were no bid contracts. That's, really massive. Another part of the Iraqi occupation, which was this sort of transfer of funds towards mainly US corporations, was the reparations part of it. Companies were able to claim for lost income from the period of time that the country was ruled by the Ba'ath Party. So you had Sheraton, for example, claiming $11 million supposedly for lost income prior to the invasion. Bechtel claimed for $7 million. Pepsi got $3.8 million of reparations. ExxonMobil got $2.3 million. KFC got over 300,000. Toys R Us got about 200,000. And Israeli farmers received $8 million in reparations for lost income because they supposedly were not able to harvest and export to Iraq during that time. And Israeli travel agents and hotels received $15 million of reparations for that period. Essentially, what we're looking at is a country which was deindustrialized. And because of the implementation of Order 12 in those 100 orders, it just became a state to which people would dump their goods. And it put about 25,000 people out of work. At the time of the invasion, you had about 500,000 people abruptly with no job. And later on, that extended to 50% of the entire workforce being unemployed. They stopped applying pesticides to the trees. So the date industry, which was formerly massive in Iraq, completely stopped for many, many years. The leather industry also immediately went from employing about 200,000 people to employing only 20,000 people. And so then this leads us to the point where the first IMF loan in 2005 was, of course, a necessity, despite the fact that all of this money was circling around Iraq, but it was being siphoned off in different directions, as you laid out before. But also one of the key things that the Bush administration did was they gave legal immunity to US personnel for any activity which was related to the economic reconstruction of Iraq. Also, Bush passed the Executive Order 13303, which gave immunity from prosecution for theft or embezzlement of Iraqi oil or any corporate crimes relating to oil. KPMG, when they were looking at the accounts of the CPA, they found 37 different contracts which were the value of $185 million put together, where none of the contracting files could be found. Mm-hmm. And you even found the advance of $3 million paid to a CPA senior advisor, which was unauthorized. So we are talking about really industrial levels of extreme corruption. You know, the development fund for Iraq was found to have $8.8 billion to $12 billion completely unaccounted for. Yeah. And so the CPA not only didn't account properly, it didn't even keep a list of the companies that it had issued contracts to. And of course, that can't be seen as incompetence when you understand how much money is at stake here and what kind of agencies of government were involved. You know, this is what some call the rule of nobody. It is an unregulated space for commercial activity, you know, lacking a coherent social contract. And this is, you know, as you sort of alluded to, this irresolvable contradiction. You have a rule of law by the gun for the population, but no law whatsoever for corporate power. As far as I understand, when you were there, or maybe just after you were there, it was the period in which you had the IMF and the US government trying to push the Iraqi government to pass the oil law, which would allow production sharing agreements. And what that would mean is essentially privatization of most of the oil fields. It would allow for 25 years to 40 years and sometimes indefinite ownership of oil fields by foreign companies. What essentially happened, though, was the pushback against this by civil society and particularly trade unions in the oil sector really blocked the Iraqi government from being able to do that. And again, it was used, George Bush used the promise of the surge to Nouri al-Maliki to sort of shore up his government, of course, well known for its corruption, as a kind of bribe in order to try and pass this law. But of course, it did not happen, largely thanks to Iraqi civil society. And as we know, that's just dealing with the corporate side of the deregulated um, activity. When it comes to the war side, Noam Chomsky has made the argument that the toxic legacy and cancer rates in Fallujah are worse than they were in Hiroshima. Hiroshima showed a 17 times increase in leukemia, but in Fallujah, some studies have found 38-fold increase in leukemia and a 10-fold increase in breast cancer. There's also been an 18% drop in births of male births in Fallujah, which is similar to the drop in male births in Hiroshima. So, we are dealing with a real juggernaut of deregulation. It's like these neocon wars making neoliberal utopias in which all of these things can happen. And when it comes to Afghanistan, and this is another thing that you have mentioned previously, something that happened was Afghanistan went the year before the occupation. It was an attempt by the Taliban to stop the trade in opium and to stop the production of it. It got very low that year, the lowest it had been at least since before the support of foreign and local fighters against the Soviet Union by the US in the 70s. It really dropped very low at that point. However, today we're in a situation where over 90% of the world's heroin originates in Afghanistan. Helmand is the center of production. The British Army had 10,000 soldiers there with 104 bases there. You've said that one of the reasons you resigned was that the US was, and I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, was effectively taking part in the established drug trade by backing drug lords like the brother of the president, Karzai. All of these things pushed to turn what someone who's really an expert in a lot of this stuff, Alfred McCoy, termed as Afghanistan being the world's first narco state. So if you could tell me a little bit about that process, but also about a character by the name of Gul al-Ghasshalzad.
Yeah, no, I mean, wow, fantastic summary. And this goes back to what you brought up in your introduction when you were talking about goes back to the Opium Wars. I mean, this is the poppy fields that produce all those opiates are a consequence of the Opium Wars. The reason that you have these poppy crops in India and Pakistan was because of that, the desire for the British to feed the Chinese right, to sell the Chinese it. But what happens is in the 1980s, the CIA and the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, bring that crop into Afghanistan in order to help fund the war against the Soviet Union. Prior to that, Afghanistan did had poppy fields, did produce opiates, but not at a level that they were exporting and making a ton of money off of. In the 1980s, that changes. And this is common with the Americans pick up from where the British leave off. The American involvement with the drug trade, there's been a complicity there in the last century, maybe longer. Certainly after World War II, there was complicity with the drug trade all through the Mediterranean in both Italy and France. The United States actually brings its imprisoned mafia leaders from the United States to Italy to run parts of Italy after the U.S. has occupied starting in 1943, 44, 45. Because the United States wants control, and these men will guarantee control. The same with in the ports of France. We've got the United States feels that it needs to, and it does, align with the narcotics rings in order to prevent a quote takeover by the communists. I mean, so there's complicity, of course, all throughout Vietnam. We know through the work of the journalist Gary Webb about how the United States CIA was involved in the drug trade, the cocaine trade, into the United States in the 1980s by the Contras in Nicaragua. This happened to help spark the crack epidemic. So this idea that somehow, and this is one of the examples I use when people ask, well, hey, how do these wars actually affect us here at home? Well, I mean, it's no coincidence that, as you described, Kareem, The opiate trade out of Afghanistan goes from pretty negligible to 80 to 90% of the world's supply. Just happens to coincide with a worldwide opioid epidemic. We have tens and tens of thousands of people here dying in the United States every year. I mean, I know it's the same in other parts of the world. So, I mean, that we're supposed to just believe that's coincidence. The American DEA lies about it. You can look at the American DEA when they testify to the U.S. Congress, the American DEA Drug Enforcement Agency. They claim that, the United States does not get any heroin from Afghanistan. But if you look at their own facts and numbers and their own graphs, and it'd be impossible for the United States not to get right any opiates from Afghanistan just because of the sheer volume, the sheer amount that the U.S. consumes. But no, I mean so the drug trade, the complicity of the Americans with the drug trade, whether it was a fact that a man named Marshal Fahim, who became the Afghan Minister of Defense, who was the largest drug trafficker in northern Afghanistan, we were providing him as the Minister of Defense with helicopters and planes. What do you think he was doing with that? I mean, a guy like Gul Sherzai, who had been the warlord in control of Kandahar in the south. Kandahar is basically the origin, the birthplace of the Taliban. The Taliban, if you know their origin story, which has a pretty good degree of truth to it, they rise up to overthrow these warlords who are preying upon the people. And that's the birth story of the Taliban. Who is the senior warlord down there? It's Gul Sherzai. Well, when the United States goes into Afghanistan, in 2001, who do they put in power in Kandahar? Sherzai, the guy the Taliban took out of power, right? I mean, because he was such a predatory warlord. He has a number of positions in Afghanistan. I knew him in Nangarhar province in the east, borders on Pakistan, has the most important border crossing. Afghanistan's a landlocked country, of course, right? So border crossings are pretty important. As governor of Nangarhar, he controls that border crossing, so he is just getting even richer than he was. But with regards to the drugs, and this is a pure gangster, pure warlord, and all the other things, not just the war crimes, but well understood, well known, well documented that he trafficked in boys. I mean, the story of the Afghan commanders, the warlords, preying on Afghan boys is absolutely true. It was part of that culture within the warlord caste that you took your pleasure with boys. That's what happened. And Americans we ignored it. And with the drug trade, there was a program that was called the Governor's Eradication Fund or something like that. And basically the idea is that if a governor of an Afghan province did a good job eradicating the poppy crops in his province, then they would be rewarded with cash, in this case, $10 million. So Gul Sherzai's family still has vast poppy crops down in the south. He's up in Nangarhar, up in the northeast. What does he do? He turns to all the and Nangarhar was a big poppy growing area. Sherzai turns to his competition basically in Nangarhar and says, either you cut me in, you kick back to me, you work for me, or I'm going to eradicate your fields. And so some of them are smart and they go along with Sherzai. Some of them think they can stand up to him. What does Sherzai have behind him? He's got not just the Afghan government, but he's got the entire, Western military presence and a lot of money. So he, supposedly eradicates these poppy crops. What he's basically doing is rubbing out his competition. And because he does such a good job with this eradication plan, the United States gives him $10 million in cash. I mean, so basically give him $10 million in cash for rubbing out his competition. I mean, that is just one example of, dozens I could talk about. I could talk about Shir Mohammed Akhundzada, Akram Wali Karzai, Abdul Rashid Dostum, Muhammad Ata Noor. I mean, names that are recognizable, but then also too, I could talk about a lot of names are not recognizable. This was This was the system. It was the entire governing structure was composed of these warlords and drug lords. Because going back to the 80s, who were the people who were controlling these poppy fields? They were the warlords of the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were controlling these poppy fields. When, so who were the people that the U.S. put in power in 2001? They were these warlords. So the very people who owned the drug trade were the ones that were in power. And then part of the great myth, one of the great lies of the war was that there was this nexus, this narco terror connection. The Taliban controlled the drug trade. The Taliban taxed the drug trade, but actually, it's been found recently that even among its taxes, the drug trade was not one of the most heavily taxed things for the Taliban. But more importantly, the Taliban did get money from the drug trade. They didn't control it. But where they got their most money from was from siphoning off of U.S. contracts over there, or Western contracts in Afghanistan, these Reconstruction contracts, or, people are probably familiar with the stories about U.S. and Western forces basically paying tolls, right, to pay taxes to the Taliban so they could drive through their territory with our supply convoys and everything. But also Taliban got plenty of money from the Pakistanis. And the most prominent source of funding for the Taliban, though, was the Gulf monarchies, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Bahrainis, Kuwaitis, etc. That was the primary funding mechanism of the Taliban for years, not the drug trade. But that was one of the great lies. So, and a two-headed lie, right? One part is the lie that Taliban control the drug trade, and the other part is the lie that somehow the Afghan government is against the drug trade, when the reality, the Afghan government was the drug trade. They're the ones who controlled it. And so the complicity there with the United States and the West said, basically making this the ends justify the means type of arguments that, well, okay, what the argument would typically shake out as, well, we know they're bad people doing bad things, but once we get this war situated, once we get things in proper order, then we can then that will all work itself out. But in the meantime, we have to work with the partners we have, because the end purpose is much greater than what is occurring in terms of the daily crimes of the Afghan government. It was all just one big charade, one big facade, one big lie.
It's interesting because what you're kind of implying is a marriage between a sort of borderless capital represented by the US government and local warlords, drug dealers, and in some cases, prostitution, pimping, and you had DynCorp International, the mercenary group owned by Veritas Capital. Of course, Veritas Capital, on their advisory board, you had the former Deputy Secretary of State in the Bush government, Richard Armitage. DynCorp were found not only in Bosnia to be selling sex slaves to each other, among each other, but then in Afghanistan, you had the example of them being found using child prostitutes. You also have the example of Armor Group. This was the mercenary or the military contractor who were tasked with guarding the US embassy. Armor Group is now owned by G4S. It wasn't at the time. But again, they were found to be frequenting brothels in Kabul. And in the end, when the case came up and the US government found them to be violating the Trafficked Persons Act, in the end, this organization, Armor Group, and by the way, it was done with the knowledge of the management of the organization. This is what the US government found. All they had to do was pay $7.5 million to the US government in a fine. So it's this kind of circular operation of this kind of stuff. The question I also wanted to ask you leading on from that actually is, you've been quoted as saying that Reconstruction in these theaters of war have been successful only for Northern Virginia. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, and actually, I think I was saying things along that line. I think it was the journalist Ryan Grimm said that about Northern Virginia. I don't want to. That's a great line.
Right.
I don't want to steal his thunder.
No worries.
One thing I just want to go back to one thing on what you brought up, though, the importance of sovereignty. This is why the United States, Britain, others have always insisted the Afghans are sovereign, the Iraqis are sovereign, right? That's complete BS. But because if those are sovereign countries, then British courts, U.S. courts have no jurisdiction there. And we have seen that continually where there's an American company called CACI, CACI, whose employees tortured Iraqis. They tortured them. And the Iraqis tried to take, CACI to court because they tortured people. And the U.S. courts throw it out because there's no jurisdiction there for U.S. courts. So that there's all kinds of legal mechanisms, and this is the the bureaucracy of empire, the institutionalization of empire. This is how things are controlled. This is how things are done. This is how the looting is accomplished. You mentioned Bosnia, and that's really where the formation of this looting gets its modern form, is in the Reconstruction work in the mid-late 90s in the Balkans. This is where these groups like Bechtel, DynCorp, Halliburton, and others, as you mentioned, really start to put an understanding and a framework to how this organized looting occurs, and also to begin to really cement that relationship with the U.S., the British governments, whoever. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of history to this, and a lot of thought behind it, a lot of legality behind it, a lot of organization behind it. It's just it works many ways informally. In other ways, it works quite formally. With this idea that Reconstruction, because that's the understanding, is that the Reconstruction effort in Afghanistan was failed, and how do you define failed? If you define what the purposes are, if the purpose was supposedly to help the Afghan people or the Iraqi people, for that matter, or for anywhere. Yeah, I mean, like 90% of Afghans live below the poverty line. 70% of Afghans live on less than $1 a day. Afghanistan is the second most food insecure country in the world. There is no industry other than the narcotics industry, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all information prior to the Taliban taking over. And since the Taliban taken over, it's got worse. That's prior to Taliban taking over after 20 years of Western occupation and supposedly all the progress the West brought to Afghanistan. That's the reality. And it got worse. And people shouldn't think that it just stayed bad. The poverty rate, remember, it's 90% now. In 2007, the poverty rate was 35%, and now it's 90%. I mean, just to make sure people understand, it got worse. The looting that occurred there, and this is what's interesting about how the American empire works, and what makes Afghanistan in particular so striking as an example of like a neo-colonial project. The looting of Afghanistan, to a lesser degree Iraq, really came from the American treasury. There was some looting of Afghan assets, but really not a heck of a lot. I mean, Afghanistan does have minerals. There's a possibility of a pipeline. None of that was ever realized in terms of extraction of wealth for what empires are known for. This is why you have empires, right? You go abroad to take from others to enrich, your society, bolster your power, etc. So in the case where you see, when you say that, as Ryan said, the one place Reconstruction was successful was Northern Virginia and also Maryland, you see that since 2001, the wealthiest part of the United States is the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Prior to that, it was Silicon Valley. Before that, it was places like Dallas and Tulsa because of the oil, the coal mining regions, New York at one point. But now, since these wars, it has been and is the wealthiest part of the United States, Washington, D.C. suburbs. You would, if you were from that area and have been struck on the head 20 years ago in a coma and woke up now, the place is unrecognizable. And this is money from the wars. The United States budget, which is more than its discretionary budget, is more than $1 trillion a year. That has grown vastly over the last 20 years. But almost all that growth has been in military spending. If you actually look at anything that's not military in the US federal budget, since 2001, it has either remained flat or actually declined. in terms of, inflation adjusted as well as population adjusted, because the United States has grown in population by 50 million people since 2001, and anything that's not connected to the military has been diminished. So where did this money come from to allow for Washington, D.C. to become the wealthiest part of the United States? It came from the war spending. So the wars were very successful for people here in the United States. I mean, plenty of corporations, and so the institutional profit, but then the individual profit as well has been massive. I mean, the circumstances people find themselves in terms of the wealth they have gained through these wars. It explains why so many people embrace the wars, even though they know they're wrong, even though that they know they're doomed, even though that they are counterproductive. Just to make sure people are clear on how open and how overt and determinative or determined this looting is. I mean, you have seen the U.S. defense budget. Half of the money spent on these wars goes to corporations. So of about the $14 trillion that has been spent by the U.S. on these wars since 2001, half of that has gone to corporations. I mean, so it's a very clear mechanism to generate profit, but it's also done on looting, and this is what makes the American empire so obscene. It's a looting of its own treasury in many ways. I mean, certainly things were taken from the Afghan people, but it wasn't the extraction. Like, in one way to look at it is Afghanistan was unplanned. I mean, it really was as if the United States was a drunk and blind giant stumbling through Afghanistan, whereas the Iraq War was totally planned. And so with the Iraq War, you can see some of the very normative imperial or colonial type efforts, as you described. Paul Bremer, who was head of the Coalition for Frozen Authority in Iraq, his 100 orders, many of them very clear. I mean, very clear. Some of those things about the closing the state-owned businesses, ensuring foreign investment. A lot of those orders were meant just to extract wealth from the Iraqis. In Afghanistan, you don't really see that, and it really is, and that's what makes that war. And it makes the American empire even more absurd than it actually is, even more barbaric. It gets to the point of, how long could something like this be sustained for?
I think what's clear from what we've touched on throughout this episode is the transactional transfer aspect of what happens in these adventures. But the question I wanted to ask you, what do you think are some of the interests, if it's something you've looked at on the other side of the fence, what are some of the interests behind this escalation with China?
With China, it is very much some of the same interests, or because you can't discount ideology. You can't discount. Many people want to assign economics and financials and wealth generation and all the things I just discussed as the primary driver of these wars, and the primary driver of American foreign policy, and that is to a degree. But like anything else, there's never one singular explanation. And if you look at the people who make these decisions, who drive these wars, who are the policy makers, and the men and women who keep showing up in both Democratic and Republican administrations, you see that their primary motivation is not to get wealthy. I mean, they are wealthy because that's going to happen as because of their positions and because of their relationships. But that's not their primary concern. Their primary concern is the maintenance of the American empire and its expansion. And you brought up Sam Huntington in the very beginning, his book Clash of Civilizations, which reflected greatly the thinking in the American foreign policy community in the 1990s, but also too over these last 20 years. Francis Fukuyama's The End of History is another one, and I think Fukuyama's book really demonstrates the thinking that was behind the neoconservatives of the Bush administration, the Cheneys, the Wolfowitzes, the Bremers, the Kalazads, the people who certainly wanted to generate wealth. Again, don't say well, I'm not saying that. But their main concern was expanding the empire for the sake of the empire. They're also heavily tarnished with the American exceptionalism, chauvinism. This idea that we have because we are the pinnacle, we have an obligation, a noblesse oblige to do, and they honestly believe this. At the same time, too, it's a chauvinism that is pervaded with violence, where something like Afghanistan, something like 9/11 happens, and there has to be punishment for this humiliation. You can't allow anyone to step out of line. I mean, that is basically understanding how the American foreign policy community views the world, views the United States' role, views the United States' responsibility as they see it. I mean, these are people, when you hear where you hear commentators talk about the loss of credibility, they're really projecting their own internal fears, their own internal frustrations, their concerns that somehow the United States is not going to be the pinnacle of civilization anymore, not going to be the strongest power the world's ever known, not going to have that primatur, have that be in that position. And the Obama administration, the people in that administration, the Powers, the Rices, et cetera, similar but different. I mean, they're not neoconservatives; they're liberal interventionists. And then the Trump people, the Mattises, the Kellys, the McMasters, they're more in the Sam Huntington's category of, like, they view the world as the Middle East in particular, the Muslim world especially, I should say, as a borderland, that, the frontiers, these are where the barbarians are, and we must protect civilization from them. I mean, so that kind of gives you a gist of the thinking, the different factions within the American foreign policy community, at least the foreign policy community that dominates the Democratic and Republican parties. With regards to China, if you understand that, then you see the Chinese encroachment on that empire as a threat, and in particular, an existential threat, because of the growth of Chinese economy, the idea that the Chinese are going to overtake the American economy, that the Americans will no longer have the imprint of being the world's strongest power. The United States won the Cold War, according to them. The United States is the end of history. The United States views Europe as a shark views the little fish that swim around its mouth and feed off of the crumbs, right? I mean, that's the junior imperial partners of Europe, basically, is how it's viewed. So that if the United States loses that point, again, these are people who are dominated by their own personal involvement with history. So to them, the fear that somehow the U.S. is going to be overtaken while they are in charge is not just a personal existential threat. And it's so amazing too, Kareem, because you and I briefly spoke about this earlier, the fact that this Chinese threat, if you will, this economic threat, because the Chinese military, certainly, for all the hype and hoopla and everything, is nothing I think that really should be too concerned about. The Chinese don't have an expansionist military interest. They have not had one. They have enough problems within their own country. I don't think anyone in Chinese leadership wants to go abroad. However, the West has pushed that. I mean, you go back to when Bill Clinton sends the aircraft carriers into the South China Sea in the mid 90s, drives those aircraft carriers right up to China's coast, basically, and threatens the Chinese. The response from the Chinese was, please don't, paraphrase them, please don't do this. If you keep doing this, we will have to respond. I mean, it's very similar to what Vladimir Putin has said. I'm not a fan of Putin at all. But what he said 20 some odd years ago, particularly when the United States pulls out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, if you do this, if you threaten us, we will have to respond. I mean, both the Chinese and the Russians over the last 25 years or so have begged the Americans not to do this, not to push your aircraft carriers up to our coast, not to push NATO to our borders. If you threaten us, we will have to respond. And and the other part, the economic part with China, is equally everything that seems so upside down, right? Because who is the one who built those factories? It was the West that shipped its manufacturing to China in the desire for short-term profits. It was the West banks that financed that Chinese economic expansion. I mean, this is all what the United States and the West have created. This Chinese economic behemoth. I mean, I don't want to take any agency from the Chinese, of course, but the American and Western involvement in the creation of the Chinese economy is undeniable. And it was done in order to get short-term profits or maybe mid-term profits for Western companies. And one of the things that you've seen, because and the economist Grace Blakely explains this very well, is that as the Chinese economy has grown, as these Chinese corporations have grown and have taken on a global presence, well, now it gets back to extraction. I mean, for centuries, the West has the Europeans first, and now the Americans. Their empires have extracted from the poorer nations, from the global south, the developing world, the poor nations, whatever you want to call them. The West every year extracts trillions of dollars from those countries. The imbalance is obscene. And China now threatens that because China now is having a global presence. Its corporations is starting to have a presence, and that rattles the American empire. Because again, the goal of empire is extraction. And now you have helped create this Chinese economic behemoth that is competing for that extraction, right? You see the Chinese presence in Africa, the Chinese presence in South America. The Chinese are, you hear this among American commentators. I'm sure it's the same in Britain and other parts of Europe. Well, the Chinese are going to be there. The Chinese are going to be there. If you hear about the U.S. Africa Command, the U.S. military presence in Africa, so often the argument is, well, we have to be there because the Chinese are going to be there. You hear the great fear about South America. The Chinese are there. Yeah, so. Oh, you're on mute.
And of course, in Africa, you are talking about 35 to 39 US bases through AFRICOM, in contrast to one Chinese base in Djibouti. So yeah, I think it's
which is an anti-piracy base too. It's like it's a joint international presence to combat piracy. So it's not even like the Chinese built their own base. Yeah, exactly. It's ridiculous. Yeah.
And so what we're seeing is Africa become the theater of really the US essentially trying to impose a relationship with it as opposed to a relationship with China. So there's interesting little dynamics that are developing across the board. But I just wanted to say, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. I think you've really helped to show the trajectory, this sort of Plato to NATO conception of history, a sort of teleological idea of the way history should have run, from the Fukuyama kind of idea. And now we're talking about what is this next stage of decline, essentially, for the US empire, and the way that new chapter to history that is being built, as far as they would see it with China now, it's certainly going to cause major existential crises, not just in the outskirts of Washington, but I'm sure in other places too. And those that decide to pin themselves to this sort of Anglo-Saxon supremacy, really, that we're talking about. Thank you so much for joining us. We could talk all day. It would be amazing to get you back for a part 2. If you can just let viewers know where they can keep up with your work. And I'm again, as Kareem stated, with the Center for International Policy. I'm on Twitter, Matthew P as in Patrick Ho, H-O-H. And if I write something, it's usually on Counterpunch or on antiwar.com as well. But I really appreciate you for having me on with you. And thanks for the work you're doing, and thanks for the work that Mint Press is doing. Thank you very much. Stay well, stay safe, speak soon.